Welcome to our channel, where everyday stories become the fire that warms the human heart. Here, we believe that kindness, integrity, and compassion never go out of style, no matter how much the world outside may change. If you appreciate genuine, heartfelt stories where ordinary people do extraordinary things, then stay with us. Because what we're about to share may just remind you of the timeless values you've held dear all your life. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you'll be the first to hear each time a new story unfolds. And if this story touches your heart, please leave us a comment, because sometimes even a few kind words can inspire an entire community. Thank you for being here. Now, let us take you into a true story about quiet strength, about justice, and about a garden hose that brought down an entire fake HOA empire. When I, Evan Miller, returned to my late mother's old house in the quiet suburbs, I had no idea the calmest days of my life would soon unravel into a chain of events so bizarre they'd feel more at home in a courtroom drama than real life. The house, once full of memories, was now the peaceful haven of my grandfather, Walter Kim, a Korean War veteran with a garden so immaculate that bees seemed to have standing appointments every morning. I had put my job hunt on pause after finishing grad school, partly because the post-pandemic job market was brutal, and partly because Grandpa needed someone by his side. He didn't speak much, didn't complain, but I could tell he was a man of routine, discipline, and quiet dignity. The same values he cultivated in his garden. The neighborhood had been marketed as a retirement-friendly oasis, quiet, safe, and surrounded by greenery. But within a few weeks, I realized that tranquility was only skin deep. Beneath the surface, there was another kind of tension brewing, small persistent conflicts between residents and one particularly eccentric woman named Karen. She wasn't elected, she wasn't appointed. Yet somehow, she had anointed herself the chairwoman of the Neighborhood Standards Committee, a title that sounded equally bureaucratic and ridiculous. No one had ever heard of such a committee. There were no official documents, no city approvals, nothing. Just Karen, her clipboard, a voice that resembled a malfunctioning smoke alarm, and a fanatical belief that the neighborhood needed governing. At first, it was just notes taped to doors, complaints about misaligned trash bins or exterior paint colors that didn't match the community aesthetic. Grandpa just chuckled. A man who'd survived artillery fire wasn't about to lose sleep over passive-aggressive memos typed in Comic Sans. But I couldn't laugh it off. Behind those silly notes was something brewing, something I didn't recognize at the time. A quiet form of control, tightening little by little. It started out laughable, then it got unsettling, and then it got dangerous. Karen's presence began to spread like mold in a damp basement, slow, quiet, but impossible to ignore. Within just a few weeks, the neighborhood took on a strange tension. Whispered conversations cropped up on sidewalks, neighbors exchanged uneasy glances, and the once casual atmosphere felt watched. And then, as if Karen's control-freak routine needed a supporting actor, she introduced her new boyfriend, Derek Slater. Derek slapped a neighborhood security patch on a reflective vest, wore dark aviator sunglasses, and carried a walkie-talkie like it was a badge, though no one ever heard another voice respond. He wasn't employed by anyone. He didn't represent a security company, but he roamed the neighborhood as if deputized by some invisible authority. I first met him while trimming the hedges. He stopped, squinted at my shears like I was brandishing a weapon, and asked, "You got a permit for that tool?" I stared. "You mean the hedge clippers?" He nodded solemnly, then leaned in and whispered like we were sharing a national secret. "There's a real HOA. Not everyone knows yet." I laughed out loud, but Grandpa just watched from the window and said quietly, "Guys like that don't stay funny forever." He was right. Not long after, Karen issued her first official violation notice, printed in color, complete with a fake stamp. The offense? A small decorative stone in Grandpa's flower bed bearing the American flag. Her reason? Excessive patriotism could jeopardize international harmony. I thought it was a joke until more complaints followed. She filed a noise grievance about the gentle trickle of Grandpa's sprinkler system, claiming it disrupted the acoustic integrity of the neighborhood. Then Derek showed up, smug as ever, and handed me a flyer titled "Understanding Strategic Landscaping," as if watering lilies was a covert act of suburban warfare. But it didn't stop at paper threats. Several neighbors, especially elderly ones living alone, began receiving payment demands for a twice-a-year community enhancement fee. These came with vague warnings about loss of access to neighborhood services for non-compliance. The scariest part? People believed it. They paid. They started obeying like it was all legally binding. Fear settled over the neighborhood like fog. Front yards went quiet. Lawn decorations disappeared. No one dared question Derek, especially when he started doing night patrols. I watched Grandpa quietly watering his flowers, but always looking over his shoulder, like the garden had eyes now. That was the moment I realized the line had been crossed. I started documenting everything: photos, videos, audio recordings, every ridiculous interaction, every fake citation. I saved it all in a folder I labeled HOA Hellscape, a digital vault for proof of things no one would believe without seeing. I didn't know what I'd do with it yet, but one thing was certain. I wasn't going to let my grandfather, or anyone else here, live under the rule of a fake regime built on a clipboard, a fake title, and a loaded bluff. I couldn't just stand by while Grandpa Walter became a target for self-appointed tyrants. His silence wasn't submission. It was a choice, a decision not to let anger define him. But I was different. When I noticed the water pressure from his garden hose suddenly drop, I knew something wasn't right. After a few hours of digging around, literally, I discovered that the underground pipe from our private well had been tapped, and not by accident. Karen and Derek had done it. Without asking, without notifying anyone, they had dug into our land and rerouted water to Karen's new garden project, something she proudly called the Zen Maze, a rose-covered labyrinth she claimed would restore communal energy. They hadn't just stolen water, they disrupted Grandpa's vegetable patch, leaving his tomatoes wilting from the irregular flow. When I confronted Karen directly, she smiled sweetly and said, "We're neighbors. Sharing is what good communities do. Water doesn't belong to just one person." It sounded like a line from a propaganda film no one asked for. I knew exactly what I needed to do. I examined their system. They'd installed a backflow preventer, barely functioning and certainly not up to code. So I rewired the system. Instead of pulling from our well, I rerouted their irrigation to a secondary tank. And into that tank, I poured gray water, dishwater, laundry runoff, and a dash of community compost tea from an old septic pump Grandpa used for fertilizing. It was, in essence, my little gift to the sharing economy. Then I waited. Over the next several days, I watched from afar. Karen's roses began to turn brown. The leaves sagged. The maze slowly transformed into a soggy, sludge-ridden mess. She never suspected sabotage, only blamed the air pollution from a nearby BBQ party, exactly as planned. And then, one glorious afternoon, I removed the cap and flushed the entire tank. The Zen maze flooded with gray water. You could smell it from 2 blocks away. Karen screamed. Derek stormed across our lawn like a one-man SWAT team, demanding to inspect infrastructure because he believed we were sabotaging community property. Grandpa was standing in his usual spot, watering the lilies. Same old shirt, same weathered boots. Derek didn't issue a warning. He didn't ask questions. He pulled a gun and shouted, "Get on the ground." That moment felt like standing between 2 worlds. A war veteran, gripping nothing but a garden hose. A fake security officer, hand trembling on the trigger. And me, already halfway through a text to my uncle, FBI, Agent Marcus Lee. 3 words, gun, Grandpa. Now, I had just sent the text to my uncle, Agent Marcus Lee, when, not even 5 minutes later, 2 black SUVs glided into the neighborhood like silent arrows. No sirens, no shouting, just the sound of tires screeching to a halt and doors flying open in near-perfect sync. Out stepped the agents, dark uniforms, eyes cold, weapons at the ready but not rushed. One of them was Marcus. He didn't need to ask what was going on. Derek, frozen in place with a gun still in hand. Grandpa Walter, standing motionless, the garden hose slipping from his grasp. That image alone said everything. "Drop the weapon." The agent's voice cut through the air, sharp, commanding, final. Derek didn't move. His hand trembled violently. the gun now less a symbol of authority and more a glaring monument to his unraveling. From across the yard, Karen screamed, charging toward him like a frantic director trying to salvage a collapsing scene. But it was too late. Seconds later, Derek was in handcuffs, his weapon confiscated, and escorted away like a child caught stealing cookies, with none of the innocence. I thought that was the end of it. But then, one of the agents turned toward Karen, pulled out a thick folder, and asked calmly, "Ma'am, we need your cooperation in an ongoing financial investigation related to the organization you refer to as an HOA." Karen went rigid. For a moment, it looked like she couldn't process what she was hearing, like she thought the FBI had come just to have a word about garden hoses. The agent continued, "We have evidence of unregistered collections, forged documentation, and suspected financial fraud involving several senior residents. You have the right not to answer, but we will proceed with a search if necessary." Karen stammered, her voice rising into that unmistakable smoke alarm pitch. But no one was paying attention anymore. I looked around. Neighbors were stepping out onto their porches, some with phones in hand, filming the moment they had only dared to dream of. An elderly woman quietly wept, not out of fear, but relief. Mr. Wallace, who had been pressured into paying maintenance fees for over 6 months, sat down on his steps like someone who had just put down a heavy weight. The agents began collecting evidence. Fake regulation signs Karen had posted on lampposts, the laminated standards manual she'd distributed, which included gems like, "Only pastel-colored outdoor furniture is acceptable." One team began inspecting the underground irrigation system, the very one Karen and Derek had illegally spliced into Grandpa's private well. Soil was dug up, white PVC piping exposed and pulled out piece by piece, undeniable proof of a carefully orchestrated theft. Karen shrieked when they entered her precious Zen maze, now a festering swamp of sludge, thanks to my re-engineering. An agent looked around and remarked dryly, "This isn't a meditation garden. This is a crime scene." For the first time, Karen had no words. The next morning, the neighborhood woke up earlier than usual, not because of lawnmowers or garbage trucks, but because the federal investigation team was still there. They hadn't just driven off after loading Derek into the SUV. They returned with thick files, cameras, soil testing kits, and eyes sharp with suspicion. To them, this wasn't just about a man pulling a gun on a veteran. It was the first tear in the curtain, revealing a far-reaching web of fraud. They began going door to door. People who had once kept quiet now opened their homes, offered tea, and shared their stories. Every phony notice, every payment made, every mandatory inspection conducted by Karen or Derek. An elderly man named Frank Wallace, voice trembling, explained that he had paid nearly $300 each quarter, afraid he'd be removed from the community if he didn't comply. He wasn't angry about the money. He was heartbroken, forever believing he had done something wrong. Mrs. Meena Kapoor, who had repainted her entire house after Karen told her the old shade of yellow was too emotionally aggressive, nearly broke down upon learning it had all been fake. Story after story spilled out, each one a puzzle piece in the scam Karen had carefully constructed. The agents collected it all, receipts, photos of fake signage, footage from doorbell cameras, even the infamous list Karen had titled "Residents Exhibiting Non-Compliant Behavior." But the tipping point didn't come from the outside. It came from within. Tom Branson, a quiet neighbor from the far end of the street, stepped forward with a USB flash drive. He had recorded private meetings between Karen and Derek, conversations where they discussed restructuring the neighborhood management system, collecting untraceable contributions via prepaid cards, and formalizing the fake HOA as a kind of community protection fund. Everything Karen had built, from the Zen maze to the ridiculous neighborhood rules to her laminated handbook of aesthetic standards, began to collapse. The agents uncovered 3 more wells that had been illegally tapped, one nearly drained to the bottom. A soil sample from Karen's garden showed contamination from bacteria, thanks to their poorly installed irrigation system. It posed a genuine health risk if left unchecked. As the investigators packed up the evidence, they also seized dozens of full-color HOA signs Karen had nailed to lampposts, along with all the documents she had distributed bearing forged city seals. One agent held up a sign and said simply, "Every single one of these is a piece of organized fraud." And Karen, She didn't scream anymore. She sat quietly in the middle of her ruined Zen maze, clinging to the HOA handbook like it was a relic of a fallen regime. No one saw her as powerful now. They only saw a woman lost in the very labyrinth she built. I thought it was over. Karen had been exposed. Derek was in custody. Neighbors had begun to lift their heads again after months of living in fear. But less than a week later, I received an envelope, no return address. My name was printed neatly on the front in blocky, deliberate handwriting. Inside was a letter written in language laced with veiled threats, dressed up as formal concern. "You have disrupted those working to maintain order," it read. "This is not over." It was signed simply, "The Board." There was no HOA recognized in our neighborhood. No board had ever been legally formed, which could only mean one thing. Someone was trying to step into Karen's shoes, to rebuild the throne she'd just fallen from. A tiny kingdom maybe, but one full of power for those bold enough to exploit it. I started digging. It didn't take long to uncover a name: Craig Donaldson. He lived at the far edge of the neighborhood, kept to himself, used to work in private security, a field where confidence and a vest could pass for credentials. Soon, he began showing up around the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, handing out slick-looking community bulletins under the logo, NCC, Neighborhood Compliance Council. It sounded official. But it was nothing more than a reboot of Karen's fake HOA, with a colder, more calculated face. Craig didn't yell like Karen or play cop like Derek. He was quieter, methodical, like someone who had studied others' mistakes and was determined not to repeat them. His documents were professionally printed, filled with legal-sounding terms. He urged residents to participate in aesthetic evaluations, to make voluntary contributions for visual unity, and to adhere to community standards as advised by compliance consultants. And once again, elderly residents started to feel the pressure. They weren't sure if this was optional, or if refusal would land them back on another blacklist. The breaking point came when Grandpa Walter received a warning letter from NCC, demanding he remove the small stone in his flower bed engraved with the American flag, because it disrupted the unified visual layout. He didn't argue. He made a short phone call. The next morning, Craig's mailbox disappeared, completely gone. In its place was a single strip of duct tape on the brick, with one word scrawled across it: "Nope." I assumed that would be warning enough. It wasn't. My garden lights were smashed. The electrical system for our sprinkler was fried. An electrician later confirmed it had been tampered with, deliberately. That's when I realized this wasn't about a fake HOA anymore. This was about control and revenge. So I rebuilt my surveillance system: hidden cameras, motion sensors, night-activated lights. 4 days later, at exactly 2 a.m., I saw him, Craig, sneaking into our backyard with a flashlight and a measuring tape, photographing our fence like he was conducting a covert operation. He thought he was smarter than Karen, but he forgot one thing. I was already playing round 2. Craig Donaldson had no idea that stepping into my backyard at 2 a.m. would turn out to be the worst decision of his life. I didn't call the cops. Instead, I sent the surveillance footage to Uncle Marcus with a single message: NCC just went big. 3 hours later, I received a reply from a federal investigations email, initiating protocol. This time, they didn't storm in like they had with Derek. They came quietly. 2 unmarked cars, 4 agents in plain clothes, no visible weapons, no tactical vests, just clipboards and eyes sharp enough to slice through concrete. When Craig opened the door, he was wearing a headset, still gripping his clipboard, muttering to himself like he was coordinating a military drill. The look in his eyes when he saw the agents wasn't fear, it was confusion. He had no idea why he was being singled out, until Marcus handed him a federal notice of investigation for harassment, impersonating a municipal officer, and suspected financial fraud. Craig tried to push back. He talked about free speech, about maintaining standards, but one of the agents coolly replied, "This isn't about your opinions. This is about you tricking elderly residents into paying money into a private account." And just like that, Craig went silent. I stood across the street next to Grandpa Walter. We didn't say a word. We just watched as Craig was led away, not in cuffs, but with no chance of escape. He looked around, expecting someone to defend him. No one did. Doors stayed shut, windows stayed dark. Karen's old throne, the one Craig so desperately wanted, had become the worst seat in the neighborhood. A few days later, our neighbor Tom Branson, the same man who had once signed a petition in support of NCC, walked over to my house. He said quietly, "I feel ashamed." Then he handed me a USB flash drive containing everything: email threads, meeting recordings, an Excel file labeled NCC Revenue Projection, Q3. It detailed how Craig had calculated fines for non-compliance, collected through prepaid Visa gift cards to avoid bank tracking. It was the knockout blow, not just because it was solid evidence, but because it came from within. Within a week, Craig was forced to cease all NCC activity. Neighbors who had stayed quiet began to speak out. One household painted their mailbox neon green and installed a mini speaker that played circus music whenever it was opened. Another flew a bright pink flag and hung a sign that read, "Free Bird, HOA Survivor." And Grandpa Walter? He built a large wooden planter box, carved into it the words, "Liberty grows here," and placed it in the center of the yard. Every evening, people brought out their folding chairs and gathered around it. They called it Freedom Hour. No rules, no dues, no enforcers, just iced tea, shared laughter, and real stories. There are battles in life that require no gunfire, no trenches, just one calm person, a garden hose, and an unshakable resolve. The story of Mr. Walter Kim, a war veteran living in what was once a quiet neighborhood, is a living testament to that truth. At an age when many choose peace and solitude as their daily companions, Walter wasn't looking for conflict, and certainly didn't want to become the centerpiece of any community movement. All he wanted was to tend to his garden, the one he once cultivated with his wife, a place that held memories, serenity, and a quiet belief in the beauty of simple things. But when that peace was threatened by those who abused the phrase community order for personal power, Walter didn't bow. He didn't fight with loud words. He didn't retaliate with reckless acts. Instead, he chose composure. He chose steadfastness. And in doing so, he taught his grandson Evan a lesson that will last a lifetime. Some things are non-negotiable, and dignity is one of them. From this story, perhaps those in their golden years will recognize something familiar. Age does not weaken the spirit. If anything, it sharpens our understanding of what's right and how to stand for it. Sometimes, the silence of the elderly isn't fear, it's discernment. They speak only when it truly matters. And when they do, their words carry more weight than any whistle blown by a self-appointed authority. We live in an era where traditional values, respect, kindness, community, are too often drowned out by noise, manipulation, and egos louder than truth. But it is often the elders, those who've endured war, loss, and change, who hold tight to what's truly right. Walter's story reminds us, to stand up against oppression, you don't have to be young to be strong. You just need to be unwavering and willing to protect what matters. And just like Walter, each of us, at any age, can become a light for the next generation. A simple gesture, an honest stance, a quiet but firm act, can all serve as beacons to others. Just like the note left behind the photo from the man who returned to the neighborhood, dignity doesn't have an expiration date. Yes, integrity is ageless, and justice, though sometimes slow, will always bloom, as long as someone out there is willing to keep watering it each day. If you felt outraged watching someone like Karen exploit the fears of the elderly to manipulate an entire neighborhood, if you've ever witnessed or experienced the silence that comes from being threatened or controlled by rules no one voted for, and if you saw a reflection of yourself, a loved one, or a kind neighbor in Mr. Walter, a man who just wanted to water his flowers but was forced to rise up and protect what's right, then please, like this video, as a statement that dignity is not something to be trampled on. Share this story so that others, especially older adults, know they are not alone. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel, where we tell true stories to defend what's good and just. Thank you for listening. We'll see you in the next story, where justice still blooms, as long as someone's willing to keep watering it.